Today on Sports Science Shorts from the Perception in Action podcast, a look at the psychology of soccer penalty kicks to get you ready for Euro 2016. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In a couple weeks, the Euro 2016 Soccer Championship will kick off with a match between France and Romania. It is highly likely that in some of these games, the outcome will be decided by a penalty shootout. So I thought today I would give you a little primer on the psychological aspects of this unique sporting situation. Note that this episode is largely based on the excellent expert statement written by Greg Wood, Mark Wilson, and Guy Jourdet, and their related work. Link as always in the show notes. If we look at what is involved in a penalty shootout in soccer, it is interesting and unlike any other high-pressure situation in sport for several reasons. First, based on the dimensions involved, scoring a goal on a penalty should be ridiculously easy. A soccer net has an area of 58.5 square meters. That is 252 times larger than the diameter of the ball. If we look at the ratio between the target and the ball in other sports, it's only 2.5 for golf, 3.7 for kicking a field goal in football, and only 1.9 for basketball. Penalty kicks are taken from a distance of roughly 11 meters towards a net that is 2.5 meters wide, giving a ratio of about 4.5. This is equivalent to making a 1.5-foot putt, a 27-yard field goal, or a 7-foot jump shot. In other words, taking a penalty in soccer should be like throwing a pebble in an ocean while standing on the shore. But of course, there are some other complications. First, unlike any of these other sports I've mentioned so far, save maybe field goal kicking, there is no opposing player trying to stop you from succeeding. But even if we take the keeper dancing around the line into account, a soccer penalty is still relatively easy. I've included a link to a Fox Sports Science video in the show notes which examines this. Even though they use a rather rotund keeper for their tests in the video, their main conclusion is still sound. Based on the speeds and distances involved, if a keeper waits to detect where the ball is going before moving, it is physically impossible for them to stop a shot right in the corner of the net. A solid kick will reach the corner in about 400 milliseconds, which in terms of time is about equivalent to a 100-mile fastball in baseball. I will return to the keeper in a second, but let's look at the last difference: relative importance. As every soccer hater this side of the world will bemoan, there is usually not a whole lot of scoring in a soccer match. On average, there are roughly 2.5 goals per game total, so about 1.25 goals per team. There are 5 shooters per team in a penalty shootout, which if the team wins is equivalent to getting 1 goal total. So each shot in a penalty shootout is effectively worth 1/5 or 0.2 goals. If we take the ratio of the worth of a penalty kick to the average goals per game for a team, it is equivalent to the final putt on an 18th green being worth 11 strokes, a free throw at the end of a basketball game being worth 15 points, or a last-second field goal in football being worth 5 points.
Turn it over to the flip side, looking for your answers, you're out to crawl. And you'll tell all of your friends you met a little someone special who likes to dance. Ooh, but they'll be waiting for the kickbacks, ripping on the rejects they call their friends.
So the bottom line is, it's not as easy as it sounds, and the stats bear this out. For the European Championships, the percentage of successful kicks and shootouts is only about 75%. If we look at the stats in a bit more detail, a large part of this seems to be linked to the pressure involved. Guy Jourdet and colleagues have calculated that shooters have a success rate of 92% when taking a kick that will give their team a win in the shootout if they make it, while this plummets to only a 60% success rate when missing the kick will guarantee a loss. Greg Wood and Mark Wilson have shown that part of the reason this drop in performance occurs is that high pressure can mess with the kicker's strategy. There are 2 main strategies that have been identified. The first, which research has shown to be the most effective, is called a keeper-independent strategy. This is where you just pick a spot to place the ball and ignore what the keeper does. As I mentioned a few moments ago, if this is executed properly, it would take a miraculous guess by the keeper to stop you. The second strategy is called keeper dependent, which is where the shooter waits until the keeper begins moving before deciding where to shoot. The problem with this strategy is that when the shooter pays attention to the keeper, it increases the likelihood they will produce a shot that will be closer to the keeper and therefore more savable. I think this effect can be related nicely back to some of the stuff I've talked about in driving, in particular steering. As human beings, we tend to act on things we are looking at. We look where we want to go, fixate on targets we're trying to hit, and so on. It's actually quite difficult to deliberately produce an action that goes away from the thing we're looking at and focusing our attention on. Greg and Mark have shown that really high pressure situations can make a shooter change from keeper independent to keeper dependent. Because, as I've discussed several times in the podcast now, anxiety can disrupt our ability to control our attention. Another factor that seems to have an effect on performance is the time taken to prepare. Gear and colleagues have found that when players rush and kick within 1 second of the referee blowing the whistle, they score only about 58% of the time, while those that slow down and take a bit longer score at a rate of 82%. I think this can be related nicely to the importance of having a pre-shot routine to avoid choking under pressure, which I discussed with Denise Hill back in episode 26A. A final factor that seems to matter is whether or not players outwardly celebrate after scoring. Even if it's not the match-winning goal, celebrating seems to boost the confidence of the shooter going after you and increase your chance of winning. So as always, I will be watching the penalty shootouts in this year's Euro Championship with a keen eye to see this high-pressure experiment in action.
You're just what I needed, just what I needed.
Are my shooting star.
You're just what I needed, just what I needed.
Are my shooting star.
Before I wrap up today's episode, I wanted to mention a couple administrative things about the podcast. At the end of May, I'm going to slow my roll a bit on the podcast and go into what I'm calling my summer block. I'll still be putting out episodes, but only about one per week. So anyone that is lagging behind, this is your time to catch up before I come back full force in August. Next month, I'm off to the NASPA conference in Montreal, where I'll be giving a couple presentations. The first is part of the pre-conference workshop organized by Nikki Hodges and Joe Baker. My talk is titled Virtual Reality in Sports Research and Training. Where have we been and where should we be going? My second presentation will be part of a symposium organized by Ruan Canal Brulin and David Mann, called Skilled Anticipation, the Role of Contextual Sources of Information. My talk is titled The Use of Extrinsic and Intrinsic Contextual Information in Sports, Performance, Presentation, and Pressure Effects. I'll be telling you a little bit more about these presentations in the podcast in coming weeks. Okay, time to put the ball in the back of the net on this edition of Sports Science Shorts. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, Ironic Effects in Baseball Pitching. As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter, @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.